Hello, friends. Welcome to Your Fresh Trails. Today, our subject is History of Nations, specifically about Brazil, the wonderful country. Did you know that it was colonized by Europeans? Come with us to find out.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture the year 1494. The globe is essentially being carved up by two massive corporate giants of the era, Spain and Portugal. They signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's basically a massive global non-compete agreement. I mean, think about how wild that is for a second. Two European kingdoms just literally drew a line down the map of the uncharted world, completely ignoring anyone who actually lived there, and basically said, all right, I'll take the left, you take the right. Spain claimed the lands to the west, which, eventually included the Philippines, while Portugal claimed the east. And sitting right there in Portugal's eastern slice was the vast, unexplored territory of Brazil. It's just fascinating because this simple, audacious line on a map set the stage for two completely different colonial paths across the globe.
So, to understand how Portugal approached this new land, we really have to look at it as a large-scale entrepreneurial venture, one that unfolded in four strategic phases. Between 1500 and 1532, it was just a raw extraction phase. They were just, testing the waters. Then from 1532 to 1600, as they tried to build permanent settlements, they relied heavily on an indigenous slavery phase to do the heavy lifting. This shifted dramatically in the 1600s to the sugar plantation phase, which completely revolutionized the global economy. And finally, from 1700 until independence in 1822, they entered a period of diversification in gold mining. Let's look a little closer at how this massive venture actually got off the ground.
Now, the Portuguese king had a massive problem. He severely lacked the capital to build this huge colonial business himself. So his solution? Franchising. Yeah, the crown established what in Portuguese are called capitanias hereditarias, or hereditary captaincies. Basically, the king sliced the Brazilian coast into these massive horizontal strips of land and licensed them out to private investors, a lot like how you'd set up a modern fast food franchise. These investors were granted immense power to govern, tax, and develop the land, as long as they took on all the financial risk and paid a steady cut back to the royal headquarters in Lisbon. But like any new business trying to find its footing, they had to undergo a major startup pivot. Step one was simple bartering. The Portuguese traded basic metal tools with the native population in exchange for pau-brasil, a valuable red dyewood that actually gave the country its name. However, just sailing along the coast and cutting down trees scattered in the jungle, well, that wasn't a sustainable, long-term business model. Competitors, like the French, were starting to pirate the coast and threaten their monopoly, so they moved to step two, establishing those coastal agricultural franchises we just talked about. Ultimately, though, to truly secure the territory and turn a massive profit, they had to pivot to step three, a permanent shift to intense, highly sedentary plantation systems.
And boy, did they desperately need this pivot. In the year 1558, a staggering statistic emerged: 2.5%. That is all the vast territory of Brazil accounted for in the Portuguese crown's total revenue. Just 2.5%. The real money for the kingdom was far away in their spice trade with India. This tiny percentage proved that the Brazil branch of the royal enterprise was severely underperforming. Honestly, it was failing. They desperately needed a highly profitable core product to make the whole Atlantic venture worthwhile.
Enter the ultimate tech boom product of the 17th century, sugar. Back then, sugar wasn't just a common sweetener you could buy anywhere. No, it was an absolute luxury item, almost treated like a rare spice or even medicine in Europe. Because shipping cargo back and forth across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean was incredibly expensive, Portugal needed an export product that had extremely high value but relatively low weight. Sugar was the absolute perfect fit. This sparked what historians actually call the sugar civilization, rapidly transforming the Brazilian Northeast into the undisputed economic powerhouse of the era. And this brilliantly illustrates the beating heart of that very civilization, the añejo. An añejo wasn't just a simple farm, it was a massive, complex sugar production mill in the state. Think of it like a modern company town, or perhaps those massive, sprawling agricultural haciendas you might be familiar with. It contained the endless cane fields, the complex milling equipment, boiling houses, and all the dwellings for the massive workforce and the owner. It required intense administrative capacity and literally the absolute latest technology of the time to process the sugarcane before it spoiled in the tropical heat. It was a 24/7 factory operation running right in the middle of the tropics. But factories of that massive scale require immense labor,
And here we have to objectively detail the tragic human cost of this mercantilist supply chain. Initially, the colonists tried to enslave the local indigenous populations. However, the indigenous peoples largely came from non-sedentary backgrounds without a history of intensive static farming. Plus, forced labor and the rapid spread of European diseases led to a catastrophic demographic collapse. Many rightfully fled deep inland into the jungle just to survive. So, to keep the incredibly profitable Ingenuus running, the colonists completely shifted their model to a horrific system of forced migration, the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved African labor, often consisting of individuals who already possessed advanced agricultural and metallurgy skills, became the brutal involuntary backbone of the entire sugar civilization. This intense, never-ending need for labor caused massive friction on the ground. On one side, you had the colonists, who fiercely demanded forced labor to keep their plantation profits soaring. On the other side, you had Catholic missionaries, primarily the Jesuits. The missionaries strongly opposed the enslavement of the natives by the colonists. Instead, they gathered the indigenous populations into centralized, controlled villages to convert them to Christianity and teach them European trades. Now, you might recognize historical parallels here with other colonized nations, where friars and missionaries centralized native populations around a central church plaza. In Brazil, this created a bitter ongoing tug-of-war over who actually controlled the local population. It was essentially a system of control disguised as protection, fundamentally changing the cultural landscape forever.
But while the sugar economy was booming on the coast, something completely wild was happening inland. 12,000 kilometers. To put that into perspective, that is like traveling the entire length of the Philippine archipelago, from north to south nearly 7 times over. That is the astounding distance traveled by one rogue expeditionary named Raposo Tavares between 1648 and 1652. He and his massive group journeyed deep into the uncharted continent, all the way to the towering Andes Mountains and down the massive Amazon River. This brings us to a whole different layer of the Brazilian colonial startup, the groups that completely ignored the rules and pushed way past the legal boundaries.
So the crucial point is understanding who exactly these people were. They were called the Bandeirantes. You can think of them as rogue corporate scouts or incredibly aggressive, independent prospectors. Operating mostly out of the poorer, more isolated southern region of São Paulo, they formed massive expeditions called bandeiras, marching under a flag, which is where the name actually comes from. They marched deep into the dense jungle to capture indigenous people and obsessively search for precious metals, completely ignoring that old Tordesillas non-compete line we talked about at the very beginning. This whole phenomenon is formally known as bandeirantismo. While their methods were incredibly harsh and ruthlessly focused on capturing human labor and wealth, their relentless trekking inadvertently mapped and claimed vast new territories for the Portuguese crown. Without even meaning to, they were essentially drawing the modern borders of the massive country of Brazil we know today. This fascinating, highly aggressive inland expansion is so crucial to the story of the nation that we will definitely be making it the main subject of future explainers. Now, looking back at the society that formed across these tumultuous centuries, it's really easy to assume it was just a simple, binary split between rich plantation owners on top and enslaved workers on the bottom. But the reality? The reality was a highly intricate, inorganic colonial pyramid. Below the wealthy señores, you had a growing class of free, poor, and skilled artisans, the carpenters, blacksmiths, and tradespeople who actually kept the massive mills running day in and day out. You also had a rapidly growing population of mixed-race individuals, small merchants, and independent farmers who grew the actual food that fed the colonies, all working alongside the massive base of enslaved laborers.
Let's move to and see how this builds a nation. When you take a step back and look at all these elements together, the strict corporate franchises given by the king, the booming sugar haciendas, the intense friction between profit-driven colonists and plaza-building missionaries, the rogue inland prospectors, and a deeply layered society forced together from across the globe, you have to ask, how do these complex layers of extreme diversity, forced labor, and rogue expansion build the ultimate foundation of a modern nation? Well, they created a massive melting pot that was simultaneously incredibly wealthy, historically unequal, and culturally complex.
Brazil's history was shaped by many different cultures and peoples as seen nowadays, making it very hard to determine that someone is Brazilian simply by their appearance. And what about you? Do you see similarities with your own country's past? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and send this video to anyone who might need it. Thanks for watching and see you next time.